Thomas Marshall had been standing at the gates of Buckingham Palace for 11 years. His black bearskin cap sat perfectly straight on his head, his red uniform pressed without a single wrinkle, and his boots shined so bright they reflected the cloudy London sky. He was known among his fellow guards as the most disciplined soldier in the Queen's Guard. Never once had he broken position during his duty. Never once had he smiled or acknowledged the thousands of tourists who took photos with him every single day. The other guards admired Thomas because he represented everything their training demanded. Complete stillness, total focus, zero interaction with civilians. His face remained as hard as stone whether children screamed in front of him or tourists tried to make him laugh with silly jokes and funny faces. To Thomas, being a royal guard meant being a living statue, a symbol of British strength and tradition. Nothing could move him, or so everyone thought. It was a Tuesday morning in late September when something began to shift inside Thomas's rigid world. The autumn air carried a crisp chill, and the palace courtyard buzzed with the usual crowd of visitors from around the globe. Families posed for pictures, tour guides explained the history of the changing of the guard ceremony, and street vendors sold miniature British flags and postcards nearby. Thomas stood at his post near the palace fence, rifle at his side, eyes fixed on the horizon as he had done countless times before. His mind had learned to drift during these long hours of stillness, floating somewhere between awareness and meditation. He could stand for 2 hours without moving a muscle, barely blinking. His body trained to endure the physical strain without complaint. Then he heard a small voice that somehow cut through all the noise around him. It was gentle and uncertain, belonging to a little girl who couldn't have been more than 5 years old. She stood directly in front of Thomas, her tiny hand gripping the iron fence that separated the public from the guards. Her mother knelt beside her, whispering something encouraging, but the little girl seemed nervous. She wore a pink jacket with a unicorn on it, and her brown hair was pulled into 2 small ponytails. What caught Thomas's attention, though he didn't move his eyes to look directly at her, was what he heard the mother say. The mother's voice carried a tender sadness as she spoke to her daughter. She explained that this trip to London was special because her daughter had been very sick. The doctors had said she was getting better now, but the journey had been long and tiring. The little girl had told her mother that her biggest dream was to see the royal guards at Buckingham Palace. To stand near the soldiers who protected the Queen, Thomas felt something stir in his chest, a sensation he hadn't allowed himself to feel while on duty. He maintained his rigid posture, but his awareness sharpened. He could hear the mother encouraging her daughter to wave at the guard, to make a memory of this special moment. The little girl waved her small hand slowly, her face filled with wonder and hope. According to every rule Thomas had ever learned, he should ignore this completely. The handbook was clear. Guards do not interact with tourists. Guards do not acknowledge visitors. Guards represent the crown with unwavering discipline. Breaking these rules could result in serious consequences, possibly even dismissal from the Queen's Guard, but standing there, hearing the love in that mother's voice and sensing the innocent hope of a child who had fought through illness, just to stand at these gates, Thomas felt his ironclad resolve begin to crack. His mind raced through the regulations, the years of training, the expectations of his commanders. Then he thought about why he had joined the military in the first place. Not just to follow rules, but to serve people, to represent something good and noble. Very slowly, so subtle that most people around might not even notice, Thomas allowed his eyes to shift downward just slightly. He saw the little girl's face light up when she realized the guard had looked at her. Then, breaking years of absolute discipline, Thomas gave the smallest nod of his head, barely perceptible, but unmistakable to the child and her mother. The little girl's face exploded into the most beautiful smile Thomas had ever seen. She jumped up and down, forgetting her tiredness, forgetting her illness, filled only with pure joy. Her mother's eyes welled with tears as she mouthed the words, "Thank you," to Thomas. They took a photo together, the mother and daughter standing in front of the guard who had just given them a moment they would treasure forever. Thomas returned to his rigid position, his expression once again neutral and professional. But inside, something fundamental had changed. He realized that being a perfect soldier and being a compassionate human being didn't have to be opposing forces. There was a way to honor his duty while also honoring the humanity of the people who came to these gates. Over the following weeks, Thomas began to notice things he had trained himself to ignore. He saw elderly visitors struggling to stand long enough for photos, leaning heavily on canes and walkers, their families worried about their comfort. He noticed children with visible disabilities in wheelchairs, their faces bright with excitement despite the physical challenges they faced daily. He observed parents carrying children with autism who seemed overwhelmed by the crowds but desperately wanted to be part of the experience. Each time, Thomas followed his training perfectly during most of his shift. But when he encountered someone who clearly needed a moment of recognition, someone who had overcome obstacles just to stand before these historic gates, Thomas allowed himself to offer tiny gestures of acknowledgement. A slight nod, a brief meeting of eyes, a tiny shift in posture that said, "I see you, and your effort matters." His fellow guards began to notice the change in Thomas. Some questioned whether he was becoming soft, whether his discipline was slipping, but others noticed something else. They saw that tourists seemed happier around Thomas's post. They observed families leaving with tears of joy rather than disappointment. They heard people talking about the guard who had somehow made them feel recognized. Despite his official stillness, Thomas started to develop a reputation among regular visitors and tour guides. Word spread quietly through the community of people who frequented the palace. If you have someone special with you, someone who has overcome challenges or who would truly treasure a moment of connection, try to position yourselves near the tall guard with the kind eyes on the eastern gate. He won't break character completely, but he has a way of making people feel seen. The palace supervisors remained unaware of Thomas's subtle acts of kindness. He was still an exemplary guard by every measurable standard. He never left his post early. He never slouched or appeared unprofessional. His uniform remained impeccable, and his dedication never wavered. The tiny acknowledgments he offered were so brief and subtle that they didn't constitute a clear violation of protocol, but Thomas knew he was walking a fine line. He understood that if someone reported him or if his superiors witnessed these moments, there could be consequences. Military discipline demanded absolute adherence to regulations, and the Queen's Guard held themselves to the highest possible standards. Thomas had seen other guards reprimanded for far less, for scratching an itch or shifting weight too obviously. Still, every time Thomas considered stopping these small acts of compassion, he would remember that little girl in the pink jacket, her face glowing with happiness, because someone in a position of authority and tradition had recognized her humanity for just one brief second. He thought about the elderly man who had served in World War II, standing proudly in his old uniform, who had smiled with profound gratitude when Thomas had given him a respectful nod. He recalled the teenage boy with Down syndrome who had laughed with pure delight when Thomas had very briefly met his eyes and given the slightest wink. These moments cost Thomas nothing except the risk of breaking with tradition. But they gave people something precious, a memory that connected them to history and humanity simultaneously. Thomas began to believe that true service meant finding ways to honor both duty and compassion, to be strong and kind, to represent tradition while also recognizing the individuals who came to witness that tradition. As autumn turned toward winter, Thomas continued his quiet rebellion of kindness, never knowing that his actions would soon be witnessed by someone who would change everything. December arrived with freezing winds that swept through the palace courtyard, carrying the first hints of snow. The crowds thinned slightly during these colder months, but the visitors who did come seemed even more determined, bundled in heavy coats and scarves, their breath visible in the frigid air. Thomas stood at his post as always, feeling the cold seep through his uniform but trained not to show any discomfort. On a particularly bitter Thursday afternoon, Thomas noticed an unusual amount of activity near the palace administrative building. Several official cars had arrived, and people in formal business attire moved purposefully through the courtyard. Thomas paid it little attention. His focus remained on his duties, though he continued his practice of offering subtle acknowledgement to those visitors who seemed to need it most. An elderly woman approached his post that afternoon, moving very slowly with the help of a walker. She wore an elegant coat that looked vintage, perhaps from several decades ago, and a silk scarf protected her neck from the wind. Her daughter, a middle-aged woman with worry lines creasing her forehead, supported her mother's elbow gently as they made their way across the courtyard. Thomas could hear their conversation as they approached. The elderly woman was explaining that she had visited these very gates as a young woman in the 1950s, just after Queen Elizabeth's coronation. She had stood in this exact spot with her late husband, both of them filled with hope and patriotism for their country. Now, more than 70 years later, she had returned. Her daughter had brought her to London from their home in Scotland as a final wish. The elderly woman had been diagnosed with terminal illness, and she wanted to see the palace one more time before she passed away. The daughter's voice cracked with emotion as she helped her mother position the walker so she could rest while they took a photograph. The elderly woman looked up at Thomas with cloudy eyes that still held a spark of the young bride, who had stood here decades before. She smiled softly, and Thomas saw in her face both the passage of time and the enduring spirit that had carried her through a lifetime of joys and sorrows. Without hesitation, Thomas made a decision. He slowly brought his right hand up to his bearskin cap in a crisp military salute, holding it for 3 full seconds. It was a clear break from protocol, a deliberate and visible action that acknowledged not just the woman's presence, but her history, her service to her country through a life well lived, and her courage in making this final pilgrimage despite her failing health. The elderly woman's face transformed. Tears rolled down her weathered cheeks as she placed her trembling hand over her heart. Her daughter gasped, immediately understanding the significance of what the guard had just done. Other tourists nearby stopped and watched. Sensing they were witnessing something profound and rare, Thomas returned to his position of attention, his expression neutral once more, but his heart pounded in his chest. He had never been so obvious before, never so clearly violated the standing orders, but he couldn't bring himself to regret it. Some moments demanded more than subtle gestures. Some people deserved to be honored openly. What Thomas didn't know was that among the formally dressed individuals in the courtyard that day was Colonel Patricia Hensworth, a high-ranking official, responsible for overseeing the ceremonial duties of the Queen's Guard. She had been conducting a routine inspection of the palace grounds and protocols. She had witnessed the entire interaction between Thomas and the elderly woman. Colonel Hensworth stood at a distance, her experienced eyes taking in every detail. She saw the breach of protocol clearly. She also saw the profound impact of Thomas's gesture on the elderly woman and her daughter. The colonel made no immediate move to approach or intervene. Instead, she pulled out a small notebook and wrote down Thomas's identification number from his uniform. Then she continued her inspection, her expression unreadable. The rest of Thomas's shift passed without incident. He completed his duties, participated in the changing of the guard ceremony, and returned to the barracks as night fell over London. He said little to his fellow guards, though several had heard about his salute to the elderly woman. Some looked at him with concern, worried he would face discipline. Others nodded with quiet approval, understanding why he had done it even if they wouldn't have risked it themselves. 3 days later, Thomas received a formal summons to appear before Colonel Hensworth in her office at the Military Administrative Building. His stomach dropped when he read the notice. This was it. He would be reprimanded, possibly removed from the Queen's Guard, his 11 years of exemplary service overshadowed by his decision to show compassion. Thomas spent the evening preparing his dress uniform, accepting whatever consequences would come. He had no regrets about his actions, even if they cost him his position. The morning of the meeting arrived cold and gray. Thomas walked to the administrative building with his shoulders square and his head high. He had served with honor, and if his superiors couldn't understand that humanity and duty could coexist, then perhaps this wasn't where he belonged anymore. Still, the thought of leaving the Queen's Guard felt like losing a part of himself he was escorted to. Colonel Hensworth's office on the third floor. A room lined with photographs of historic ceremonies and military honors. The colonel sat behind a large wooden desk, her uniform decorated with medals earned over decades of service. She looked up as Thomas entered, her face stern and professional. Thomas stood at attention and saluted sharply. Colonel Hensworth returned the salute and instructed him to sit. The silence that followed felt heavy, stretching out as the colonel reviewed some papers on her desk. Thomas waited, his training keeping his expression neutral even as uncertainty churned inside him. Finally, Colonel Hensworth looked up and spoke. Her voice was firm but not unkind. She told Thomas that she had witnessed his salute to the elderly woman several days prior. She confirmed that his action constituted a clear violation of standing orders regarding guard conduct and interaction with civilians. She noted that such violations typically resulted in formal reprimand and potential reassignment away from ceremonial duties. Thomas nodded, accepting her words without excuse or explanation. He had known the risks when he acted. But then Colonel Hensworth did something unexpected. She leaned back in her chair and asked Thomas to explain his thinking. Not as a superior demanding justification from a subordinate, but as one soldier to another, genuinely wanting to understand his perspective. Thomas spoke carefully, but honestly. He explained that he had always prided himself on perfect discipline and adherence to protocol. But over recent months, he had begun to question whether rigid rule following truly served the highest purpose of their duty. He described the sick little girl, the elderly veteran, the people with disabilities who overcame enormous obstacles just to witness the traditions the guards represented. He told the colonel that he believed their role was not just to stand motionless, but to embody the values that made their nation worth defending: compassion, recognition of human dignity, and service to those who needed it. He acknowledged that he might be wrong, that his interpretation might be too personal and not aligned with military expectations. But he couldn't convince himself that being a good soldier meant ignoring the humanity of the people they supposedly served. If that made him unsuitable for the Queen's Guard, Thomas said quietly, then he would accept that judgment and move on. Colonel Hensworth listened without interruption, her expression thoughtful. When Thomas finished speaking, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she told Thomas something that surprised him completely. She said that she had been observing guard conduct for over 20 years, and she had seen hundreds of soldiers come and go. Most followed the rules perfectly, becoming human statues exactly as their training demanded. They were good soldiers, disciplined and reliable, but occasionally, the colonel continued, she encountered a soldier who understood something deeper about service. Someone who recognized that rules existed to serve a purpose, not just to be followed blindly. Someone who could honor tradition while also honoring the individual human beings who came to witness that tradition. These soldiers were rare, the colonel said. And they were precious. She told Thomas that she had made inquiries over the past few days, speaking quietly with tour guides, regular visitors, and even some of Thomas's fellow guards. What she discovered was that Thomas had developed a reputation for small acts of kindness that never compromised his military bearing or the dignity of his position. He had found a way to be both perfectly disciplined and genuinely compassionate. The colonel stood and walked to her window, looking out over the palace grounds. She told Thomas that the Queen's Guard existed not just to protect buildings and follow protocols, but to represent the best of what their nation stood for. That meant strength and discipline, yes, but it also meant recognizing that true strength included the courage to show compassion when it mattered most. She turned back to Thomas and told him that she would not be filing a formal reprimand. Instead, she was going to do something different, something that had never been done before in the history of the Queen's Guard. Colonel Hensworth explained her unprecedented decision to Thomas with careful precision. She was creating a new unofficial guideline for the Queen's Guard, one that would be communicated quietly to trusted senior guards but never written into formal regulations. The guideline acknowledged that while maintaining military discipline and traditional protocol remained paramount, guards were permitted to exercise compassionate discretion in extraordinary circumstances. The parameters were specific: If a guard encountered children who were clearly ill or had visible special needs, elderly individuals who had made significant effort to visit the palace, or people with obvious disabilities who would deeply cherish a moment of recognition, the guard could offer subtle acknowledgement. This acknowledgement should never compromise military bearing, never become casual or routine, and never turn into entertainment for general tourists. It was to be reserved for truly meaningful moments with individuals who would treasure the interaction as something profound. Thomas listened with growing amazement. He had expected punishment, possibly the end of his career with the Queen's Guard. Instead, the colonel was essentially validating his instincts and creating a framework that would allow other guards to follow similar principles. The colonel emphasized that this was not permission to break protocol freely, but rather recognition that the spirit of their service sometimes required flexibility. Within the boundaries of discipline, she told Thomas that he would be responsible for quietly mentoring other senior guards on this approach, teaching them how to identify appropriate moments and maintain the delicate balance between tradition and compassion. The colonel trusted Thomas because he had proven over 11 years that he understood discipline deeply enough to know when and how to bend without breaking. Thomas left the colonel's office feeling as though he had stepped into a different reality. Not only had he avoided punishment, but he had been given a mission that aligned perfectly with what he had discovered about meaningful service. He spent the following weeks meeting privately with select guards, sharing his experiences and the colonel's guidance. Some guards embraced the idea immediately, relieved to have permission to act on their own compassionate instincts. Others remained skeptical, preferring the clarity of absolute rules. Thomas respected both responses, understanding that each soldier had to find their own path within their service. As winter deepened and Christmas approached, Thomas noticed changes in the atmosphere around the palace gates. The guards who had adopted the compassionate discretion approach seemed to stand with a different kind of presence. They remained disciplined and professional, but there was a new warmth in the courtyard, an invisible shift in how people experienced their visit to this historic place. Word continued to spread through the community of regular visitors and tour guides. Families with special circumstances began to hope for moments of connection with the guards, though they understood these moments were never guaranteed and always subtle. The guards maintained their primary duty of representing tradition and protocol, but now that representation included acknowledging the individual stories of courage, perseverance, and hope that walked through the palace gates every day. A few weeks before Christmas, Thomas encountered a situation that would test the full meaning of the colonel's guidance. A school group arrived at the palace. Children around 8 and 9 years old, bundled in matching scarves and hats, their teachers struggling to keep them organized in the cold. Among the excited children was a boy who moved differently from the others. He used crutches and wore leg braces, his progress across the courtyard slow and effortful while his classmates rushed ahead. The boy's name was Marcus. Thomas learned from overhearing the teacher, and he had been determined not to miss this field trip despite his physical challenges. The other children had already taken their photos with various guards and moved on, but Marcus was still making his way across the courtyard, his arms straining with each step. The teacher stayed beside him, encouraging but not rushing, clearly accustomed to matching Marcus's pace. By the time Marcus reached Thomas's post, the rest of his class was already gathering near the exit, ready to move on to the next destination on their tour. Marcus looked up at Thomas with a mixture of exhaustion and determination. He had made it. Despite the cold, despite his physical limitations, despite being slower than everyone else, he had reached the guard he wanted to see. Thomas saw in that moment every struggle Marcus had overcome just to stand here. The daily challenges of navigating a world not built for his needs. The frustration of always being slower, always working harder than others for the same experiences. The courage it took to keep trying when giving up would be so much easier. The teacher began to take a quick photo, conscious of the waiting class and the cold affecting Marcus's already tired body. But Thomas made a decision. He stepped forward from his post, just one step, and lowered himself into a kneeling position so he was at eye level with Marcus. It was a dramatic break from protocol, visible to everyone in the courtyard. Then Thomas extended his hand for a handshake. Marcus's face showed shock, then overwhelming joy. He shifted his weight on his crutches and carefully extended his own small hand, shaking Thomas's with as much strength as he could muster. Thomas held the handshake firmly but gently, looking directly into Marcus's eyes with an expression that conveyed respect and recognition. 5 seconds passed, an eternity in guard time, before Thomas released Marcus's hand, stood and returned to his position. The courtyard had gone nearly silent. Tourists who had been taking photos of other guards turned to watch. Marcus's classmates, who had been chattering impatiently near the exit, stopped and stared. The teacher had tears streaming down her face as she captured the moment on her camera. Marcus stood taller on his crutches, his exhaustion forgotten, his entire being radiating pride and happiness. Thomas knew this interaction would likely be reported. It was too public, too clear a departure from normal protocol. But just as before, he had no regrets. Marcus needed to know that his effort mattered, that his courage was seen and honored. If that cost Thomas his position, then so be it. Some things were more important than rules. The school group left the palace with Marcus surrounded by his classmates, all of them talking excitedly about what they had witnessed. The teacher made a point of walking over to Thomas before they departed, thanking him with simple words that carried enormous meaning. She told Thomas that Marcus struggled with feeling different and limited, but this moment would show him that he was seen as strong and worthy of respect. That message, she said, was worth more than any lesson she could teach in a classroom. That evening, Thomas prepared himself for potential consequences. He wrote down his thoughts about the interaction with Marcus, wanting to articulate clearly why he had acted as he did if questioned by his superiors. He believed deeply that some moments required more than subtle gestures, that sometimes compassion demanded visibility and clarity. If the military disagreed, then perhaps their definitions of honor and service were too different to reconcile, but the call to Colonel Hensworth's office never came. Instead, 3 days later, Thomas received a different kind of message. A video of his interaction with Marcus had been posted online by one of the tourists who witnessed it. Within hours, it had been shared thousands of times across social media. People around the world commented on the beauty of the moment, praising the guard who had shown that strength and kindness were not opposing qualities but complementary ones. The video reached news organizations, and soon reporters were asking the palace for comment about the guard who broke protocol to honor a child with special needs. The palace press office, after consulting with military leadership including Colonel Hensworth, released a carefully worded statement. They noted that while guards are expected to maintain traditional protocol, the Queen's Guard represents values of honor, service, and recognition of human dignity. The guard in the video had exercised appropriate discretion in acknowledging a young person who demonstrated remarkable courage and determination. The statement was deliberately vague about whether such actions were officially sanctioned, but it didn't condemn Thomas's behavior. More importantly, it framed his action within the context of the guard's highest values, suggesting that compassionate discretion could indeed align with military honor. When exercised appropriately, Thomas found himself unexpectedly in the public eye. News programs played the video repeatedly, often alongside interviews with disability advocates who praised the guard's recognition of Marcus's achievement. Parents of children with special needs shared their own stories of how society often overlooked their children's efforts, making Thomas's gesture even more meaningful. Because it came from someone representing such formal tradition and authority, Marcus's family was contacted by several news organizations. His mother gave an interview describing how Marcus had talked about nothing but the handshake since returning home, how he kept rewatching the video and showing it to everyone he met. She explained that Marcus faced daily challenges that most people never noticed or acknowledged, making Thomas's very public recognition of his effort something that would shape how Marcus saw himself for years to come. The response was overwhelmingly positive, though there were some critics who argued that military protocol existed for important reasons, and shouldn't be compromised for emotional gestures. Thomas understood these concerns and didn't entirely disagree. Protocol and discipline were crucial to military effectiveness, but he also believed that the most important protocols were those that governed why soldiers served in the first place: the protection and honoring of the people who gave meaning to their service. The weeks following the video's viral spread brought unexpected changes to Thomas's life and to the atmosphere around Buckingham Palace. Visitors came with new expectations, hoping to witness similar moments of connection between the guards and people with special circumstances. Thomas worried that this attention might transform meaningful gestures into performances, exactly what Colonel Hensworth had warned against. The colonel called Thomas for another meeting, but this time her tone was different, more collaborative than supervisory. She explained that the video had created both opportunities and challenges. The positive public response had shown that people deeply valued the human dimension of military service, but there was a risk that guards would feel pressured to create these moments artificially, turning authentic compassion into theatrical displays. Together, they developed a clearer framework. Guards would continue to exercise compassionate discretion, but only when genuinely moved by specific circumstances, never because cameras were present or tourists were expecting it. The moments had to remain authentic, arising from real recognition of someone's courage, effort, or special circumstances, not from a desire to replicate a viral video. Thomas was tasked with ensuring other guards understood this distinction clearly. Over the following months, Thomas observed how different guards interpreted the guidance. Some found their own authentic ways of acknowledging special visitors. A guard named James developed a practice of maintaining eye contact a few seconds longer than normal when children with visible disabilities approached, a subtle acknowledgement that meant everything to those families. Another guard, Sarah, perfected the art of the slight nod for elderly veterans who arrived wearing their service medals, a gesture of military respect that honored their shared commitment to service. But there were also guards who struggled with the ambiguity, preferring the clarity of absolute rules. Thomas spent time mentoring these guards, helping them understand that compassionate discretion wasn't about breaking rules freely, but about recognizing the rare moments when the spirit of their service required acknowledging individual human dignity. He emphasized that most of their duty would remain exactly as it had always been, the traditional stillness and protocol that honored centuries of military tradition. The tourist experience at Buckingham Palace gradually evolved. Families with children who had special needs began to plan their visits more thoughtfully, understanding that while they might receive a moment of recognition from a guard, it was never guaranteed and always subtle. The uncertainty actually made the moments more precious when they did occur. Parents learned to prepare their children for the possibility of disappointment while also nurturing hope for something special. Thomas encountered a teenage girl named Sophie about 6 months after the Marcus video. She arrived at the palace in a wheelchair, accompanied by her parents and younger brother. Sophie had been in a severe car accident that left her paralyzed from the waist down. Her rehabilitation had been long and painful, filled with surgeries and physical therapy sessions that tested her resilience every single day. Thomas overheard Sophie's mother explaining to her brother that Sophie had specifically requested this trip to London. Before the accident, Sophie had been a competitive dancer, someone who expressed herself through movement and physical strength. Losing that ability had devastated her, leaving her searching for new ways to understand her identity and worth. She had watched the video of Thomas and Marcus dozens of times, her mother said, finding hope in the idea that someone could recognize strength that looked different from traditional expectations. Sophie sat in her wheelchair in front of Thomas, and he could see in her eyes the complex emotions of someone rebuilding themselves after tragedy. She wasn't seeking pity or special treatment. She was asserting her presence, claiming her right to be here and be seen despite the ways her life had changed. Her hands rested confidently on her wheelchair wheels, and her posture radiated determination. Thomas made his decision quickly. He stepped back from his post and executed a full military salute, holding it for several seconds while looking directly at Sophie. The gesture acknowledged not just her presence but her courage in facing each day, with a body that no longer worked the way she had known. It recognized her as someone worthy of the same respect given to any soldier who had faced and overcome tremendous challenges. Sophie's reaction was immediate and profound. She sat up straighter, placed her hand over her heart, and tears rolled down her face. But these weren't tears of sadness or pity. They were tears of recognition, of feeling seen and valued in a fundamental way. Her father stepped forward and shook Thomas's hand, unable to speak through his own emotional response. Her mother mouthed, "Thank you," while holding her younger son, who watched with wide eyes. Beginning to understand something about the sister he thought he knew so well, that moment, like the one with Marcus, was captured on camera by other tourists. But this time, Thomas barely noticed the phones and attention. He was focused entirely on Sophie, on ensuring she understood that her worth wasn't diminished by her circumstances, that strength took many forms, and that she embodied resilience just as surely as any soldier who had faced battle. The video circulated online, though it never reached quite the viral status of the Marcus moment. But it didn't need to. For Sophie and her family, that one interaction became a turning point. Her mother later wrote to the palace, explaining that Sophie had returned from London with renewed determination to build a meaningful life. She had enrolled in university to study disability advocacy, wanting to create a world that recognized the strength of people living with disabilities. The Guard's salute, her mother wrote, had given Sophie permission to see herself as strong again, just in a different way than before. As time passed, Thomas began to understand the full impact of what had started as simple acts of personal compassion. He received letters from families across the country and around the world, people who had visited the palace and experienced moments of recognition from various guards. They described how these brief interactions had affected their children's self-esteem, given elderly relatives precious final memories, or helped people with disabilities feel valued by society in ways they rarely experienced. One letter came from Marcus's teacher, written a year after that cold December day. She explained that Marcus had struggled with feeling different and limited throughout his early childhood. But after the handshake with the Royal Guard, something shifted. Marcus began talking about his challenges as things he was working to overcome rather than limitations that defined him. He pushed himself harder in physical therapy, not because he thought he needed to be fixed, but because he wanted to honor the respect the Guard had shown him by becoming the strongest version of himself possible. The teacher described how Marcus had become a leader among his classmates, teaching them about perseverance and different kinds of strength. He had given a presentation to the school about his experience at Buckingham Palace, using it to explain that everyone faces challenges and everyone deserves recognition for their courage in facing those challenges. The handshake from the Royal Guard, the teacher wrote, had given Marcus a story about himself that centered on strength rather than limitation, and that story was shaping the person he was becoming. Reading these letters, Thomas realized that his small acts of compassion had created ripples far beyond what he had imagined. But he also understood that the impact wasn't really about him at all. It was about what these moments revealed to people about themselves, about their worth and their place in the world. The uniform and tradition Thomas represented gave his gestures weight and meaning, but the real power came from the recognition itself, from seeing and being seen, from acknowledging that every person who stood before these historic gates carried their own story of courage and determination. Colonel Hensworth called Thomas for a final meeting as his tour with the Queen's Guard approached its natural end after 13 years of service. She told Thomas that the guidance on compassionate discretion had been quietly incorporated into training for new guards, though never officially written into regulations. Young soldiers joining the Queen's Guard now learned not just about protocol and tradition, but also about the responsibility to recognize human dignity within the boundaries of military service. The colonel explained that Thomas had helped evolve what it meant to be a Royal Guard, expanding the definition to include not just perfect discipline, but also appropriate compassion. She noted that the guards who followed this approach seemed to find more meaning in their service, understanding themselves as representatives not just of military tradition but of the values that gave that tradition purpose. Thomas retired from the Queen's Guard with full honors, his 13 years of service celebrated in a private ceremony attended by fellow guards and military leadership. He had served longer than most, and his service had been marked by both perfect discipline and meaningful innovation. Several guards spoke at the ceremony about what they had learned from Thomas, how he had helped them understand that being a good soldier meant serving people, not just following rules. In his retirement speech, Thomas spoke simply about his experience. He explained that he had joined the military to serve something larger than himself, to represent the best values of his country. For many years he had believed that meant being a perfect statue, following every protocol without question or deviation. But over time, he had discovered that true service required seeing the people who gave meaning to those protocols, recognizing their stories, honoring their courage, and acknowledging their humanity. He told the assembled guards that they had the privilege of standing at one of the world's most historic and symbolic locations, representing centuries of tradition and military honor. But they also had the privilege of encountering thousands of individual human stories, people who came to these gates carrying hopes, challenges, memories, and dreams. The art of being a great guard, Thomas said, was finding the balance between honoring tradition and honoring the individuals who came to witness that tradition. After the ceremony, Thomas walked through the palace courtyard one final time in civilian clothes. He stood where he had spent thousands of hours at attention, where he had perfected the art of stillness, where he had gradually learned that strength included the courage to show compassion. He thought about the little girl in the pink jacket who had started this journey, about Marcus and Sophie and the elderly woman and the countless others who had taught him what service really meant. As Thomas turned to leave, a family approached the guard currently on duty at his old post. A young boy in a wheelchair smiled up at the guard, hope and excitement bright in his eyes. Thomas watched as the guard, maintaining perfect military bearing, gave the boy a subtle nod of recognition. The boy's face lit up with joy, and his parents took a photo that would become one of their most treasured memories. Thomas smiled and walked toward the gate, knowing that the tradition of compassionate service would continue without him. He had helped plant seeds that would grow in ways he would never fully see or know. And that, he thought, was exactly what meaningful service looked like. Not grand gestures or viral moments, but quiet acts of recognition that help people understand their own worth and strength. Sometimes the most powerful thing a person could do was simply to see another person clearly and let them know, through the smallest of gestures, that their courage mattered and their story deserved to be honored. The gates of Buckingham Palace stood as they always had, guarded by soldiers in red uniforms and bearskin caps, representing centuries of British tradition. But now, woven into that tradition was something new and old at once, the understanding that true strength included compassion, that perfect discipline could coexist with human kindness, and that the highest form of service meant recognizing the dignity and courage present in every person who stood before those historic gates.